Hello and welcome to the second segment of the day. Now, a little bit earlier, myself, Raz, and Nate discussed the collapsing world order.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, after Nate had left, we turned to each other and said, well, actually, we probably need to follow up on some of these points.
Yes.
So this segment isn't going to make any sense unless you watch that one first. But we kind of touched on a number of areas and what is happening. We didn't
Yes.
really get the chance to go into the implications of, well, what happens after
Yes.
this stuff happens.
Yes.
So where do we began with Taiwan, didn't we?
We started with the fact that the Americans were telling the Japanese to stay calm and not antagonize China because they'd proven that they couldn't fight a trade war, that the Americans couldn't
Yes.
fight a trade war against China. We then moved a little bit to Europe and explained how the Americans were more or less fed up with NATO. They've had it with Ukraine. They don't want to be involved anymore. They're getting ready to leave. And then we moved to Latin America and we explained that really this is going to be the big priority for the US
Yes.
because the fact that there is massive Chinese influence in Latin America and the fact that the insane lefty governments of Latin America are enabling crime, immigration, drug dealing, all kinds of problems that are affecting the US directly means that LATAM has become a domestic and geopolitical problem for the Americans, and this is going to be the priority.
But
starting with
essentially,
Venezuela.
big picture is America had been embroiling itself in lots of very tertiary important conflicts for the
Yes.
last 20 years, and it had been neglecting its own sphere of competence, which is
Exactly.
the Americas. It's the Western Hemisphere.
Yes.
Where China is actually getting quite ruthless on its own zone of competence to the
Yes.
point where it looks like it actually could shrug off the US.
Yes.
I mean, starting back on the Taiwan thing, the significant thing for me was not that the US was trying to longhouse Japan into not threatening China,
Mhm.
but the reason the Americans were doing that is because the Chinese told them
Yes.
to longhouse Japan.
The Chinese more or less told them that we will restart the trade war if you don't keep the Japanese in line. And so the Americans called the Japanese and said, please behave yourselves.
But that essentially, what they essentially mean by that is stop the Japanese from saying that we don't have the first claim on Taiwan.
Yes.
So I suppose
Exactly.
the logical question from that is, you know, the upcoming Chinese invasion of Taiwan
Mhm.
has been sort of penciled in for next year for quite a while now.
Yes.
At what point do you think it does go live, and when does it go live?
The Americans are saying that the Chinese are planning to do it in 2027. And as a timeline, this makes sense because a lot of the ferries that the Chinese would need to get into Taiwan
Mhm.
get completed by late 2026. So 2027 looks realistic.
Okay.
And the question is, do they do it or don't they do it? Or do they do it half peacefully? Or do they instigate some kind of political crisis that's almost military and looks like a blockade but isn't a full-on invasion? These are the relevant questions. As to the timeline itself, we can look at the capabilities, but we don't have enough information to say this is what the decision makers are saying privately. But the capabilities would be already by,
Okay.
theoretically, they could do it now, but they would be in
Yeah.
a stronger position in early 2027.
So, I mean, obviously, projections are very difficult to make, and you tend to look foolish when you do make them, unless you're one of the outliers who just happens to nail it. But
Yes.
2027 is our base case on this. It does involve transferring assets across the Straits of Taiwan.
Yes.
You talked about the 70 ferries that are being produced at a high capacity for military transport as well as troops
Yes.
and all the rest of it. But one of the things I touched upon is a key element of Taiwanese defense is the fact that the US park subs in the Taiwanese Strait.
Yes.
And the American president has it at his disposal to, on day one of such conflict, to say, okay, just start sinking Chinese naval assets.
Yes.
But that's still quite a bigger decision for an American president to make.
That's a huge decision because it means the Chinese then attack American bases all over East Asia. Well, that would be the next logical
You think
step.
it would instantly escalate into
I mean,
a regional conflict.
if the Chinese aren't ready for a regional conflict, they wouldn't take the risk of invading Taiwan in the first place.
Okay.
They have to assume that as part of the planning. And they have to assume that if the Americans do something, then something must be done to deter them or to raise the price to them. So that would be within the planning assumptions of the PLA. That might lead them to conclude we're too vulnerable to a naval blockade. There's nothing we can do about American submarines or aircraft carriers, and therefore we don't want to end up in a naval blockade and we won't fight this war. And we will keep up political pressure on Taiwan while having our military ready.
Mm-hmm.
That's an option. Another option is to say, well, if this is what the Americans decide to do, we'll do it anyway. And time is not in our favor because the Americans are trying to reindustrialize and consolidate over Latin America. If they do that successfully, then we would have lost our window to act.
Is it possible the other Chinese strategy is to make it look so likely that they're going to invade Taiwan that the Americans have no choice but to develop their own chip manufacturing domestically? And once that is done, Taiwan simply isn't important enough to be worth defending.
Maybe. And we're seeing the Americans working on developing their chip capabilities, but this takes 1 or 2 decades to complete.
I mean, it is a substantial amount of capex that you need to put into these plants and expertise, and the Americans are starting from a low base on this.
Yes, exactly. So they're the ones with the designs, and the Dutch are the ones with the machines that enable the building of the chips. So they have a decent position, but that has to translate into massive capex and worker training. Now, you could solve some of that by sending a bunch of jets to Taiwan and getting everybody who works for what's it called? The
TSMC or something like that.
Yes, exactly. And putting them on a plane and taking them to Nevada or Arizona, and that's it.
I mean, that's still a challenge because these people are going to say, well, yeah, but what about my families?
Well, they could easily take in 300,000 people from Taiwan. That's within the capabilities of the Americans. And that they're not going to be like Somali migrants.
No.
So, there's an upgrade.
No, they're going to be industrious Taiwanese. But also, what about the Taiwanese point of view? Because they have got a small population. They've got a rubbish fertility rate. I mean, they're dying out as a people anyway due to the small population and low fertility rate. They can't afford to lose a generation of young men. So do they even fight the war in the first place? Or does it just get to the point where China says, look, we're doing it, and Taiwan just surrenders?
Look, what the Russians tried to do with Ukraine was keep on building up on the border and making very serious threats to convince them that they were really going to invade and to get Ukraine to sign a peace agreement or to sign some kind of paperwork that says we're not going to be part of NATO, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do that. And that was still an option in April 2022, 2 months after the invasion, where the Russians said, look, we will back down if you sign these papers. And the Ukrainians were willing to sign, and then Boris Johnson said no. So obviously not on his own behalf, obviously acting on behalf of the Americans. So you could see something similar, but the Taiwanese end up saying, okay, fine, we've had enough. Especially given the fact that without the imports of oil and the imports of natural gas, their economy cannot function. Without energy, they collapse much faster than the Ukrainians. So they aren't in a position to fight a long war in the same way. And therefore they might decide, okay, we have to accept this now. Here we are. Maybe this is what the Chinese would hope for. Instigate some kind of crisis, blockade Taiwan, and keep it just below full-scale military and force a surrender.
Yes, I see your point. Russia raised the cost for Ukraine of not accepting the deal, but they still didn't accept the deal anyway.
Exactly.
So China has to bear that in mind. They might want to position this as it's better to do a deal, but you have to be willing to commit to the military action if they just decide to be bloody minded about it.
And you have to accept the possibility of broader escalation.
What about the angle of Japan? Because, I mean, we actually started with Japan, didn't we? And about how the Chinese basically instructed the US to tell them to back down. But let's take the Japanese at their word, and they say that actually Taiwan is existential for them.
Yes.
And Japan is also willing to escalate in a Taiwan conflict. They've just found out that when push comes to shove, the Americans are willing to bend to the Chinese demands,
At least for now, yes.
at least for now. What does that do to Japanese?
Either they decide to bide their time and fortify themselves further and maybe build nuclear weapons. Going it alone, very, very risky. Relying on the Americans to supply them and having incredibly unsecure supply chains because of their naval position. I mean, they have a decent navy, but can they police it all the way from the Americas to Taiwan to Japan itself, knowing that the Taiwan Strait is close to them? That's a bit of a difficult ask.
Would they not just go the other way across the Pacific?
Well, across the Pacific, yes, but even then, you would see Chinese submarines in the Pacific targeting Japanese shipping.
So can they afford, if China does attempt to realise its regional ambitions, can China afford to not back down?
No. If the Chinese decide that they're going to commit to this, they have to commit to this all the way. That's the nature of these conflicts. Once you're in it, you're in it. That's it. You can't be half in a war, as Hezbollah learned in Lebanon. They got crushed precisely because they half committed.
All right. So, I mean, the broader theme we were talking in that podcast was the collapse of the global world order.
Mm-hmm.
If China is able to assert regional dominance in 2027, or even if it's a couple of years later, I mean, the illusion of of America as the sort of global policeman, that is just gone.
Well, it's gone for Europe.
Yes.
It's definitely gone for Europe regardless. Because of what Trump has been saying, that we won't fight to defend Europe, and what Bessent has been saying, that we won't fight to defend Europe, which is very much the view of Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, and Vance, the Vice President.
Well, his comments basically tore up NATO.
More or less. And so the real loser in all of this are the Europeans. So I put out a piece on Modad Geopolitics saying that there is going to be a decade of sorrows for Europe. And decade might be optimistic. Because if you look at the demographics of Europe, that's extremely bad. You look at the pension liabilities of Europe, when you include those in the debts, the debt to GDP for European countries goes up to maybe 500-600%, which is an insane amount. Then you have to factor in the migrants, who are a net liability economically and in terms of security. And then you have to factor in the fact that European governments have spent the last 2 decades, essentially, saying to anybody who would be willing to volunteer into their militaries that they're far right.
Yes.
So there is this tragic reality
the only
that Europe is
people
facing.
the European militaries want in their military are people who don't want to join the military.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's like the Groucho Marx quote.
Yes.
But even more insane, yes.
Exactly. So Europe is facing a disastrous situation as a result of the Americans leaving them. Because on top of all of these liabilities, now they have to spend money on defense.
Yes.
But they've compromised their ability to defend themselves with the madness of net zero.
Yeah, and to be clear to our American audience, I'm not actually blaming Trump for any of this.
No.
Because he tried several times to say to the Europeans, let's put this Ukraine business to bed. But the Europeans kept on blocking him. They kept on having these little conferences where they got together and said, no, we're going to back Ukraine to the last Ukrainian. Once the last Ukrainian man has died, then we think about peace, but not until that moment.
Exactly.
So they really, Trump has been left with no other option than to say, okay, fine, we're walking away from NATO.
It's the same as you would do if you have a friend who's addicted to drugs.
Yes.
The first time you speak to them, second time, third time, let me put you in rehab, let me help you, let me do this. Eventually, okay, mate, you're on your own.
Yeah, you have to walk away.
You have to walk away. And this is precisely what we're seeing. The European elites are addicted to suicidal policies that are deeply destructive to their own societies, from the confrontation with Russia, which destroyed their energy security, to the underspending on defense, and now they have to compensate for that, to immigration, to net zero, to a massive welfare state that fundamentally discourages fertility because it removes all family responsibilities and places them in the hands of the state. You therefore have no reason to have children because you believe that the state is going to take care of you cradle to grave. The only people who will take care of you cradle to grave are your family.
Mm. Well, the welfare system of Europe does encourage one set of people to have large families, and that's
Yes,
Pakistani
obviously.
immigrants.
Algerian immigrants
Yeah.
if you're in France, Syrian immigrants if you're in Germany.
Mm.
So long as you're not actually European, you're fine.
So here's one of the things we didn't get to talk about in the segment is where does Europe end up in all of this? Because it has been so suicidal for so long that pulling this around at this point, I mean, God, where to start?
You have to start with the fact that Turkey is a rising power with serious industrial capability, a serious military, a fertility problem, but nowhere near as bad as Europe, and an ability to assimilate migrants from the rest of the Middle East under the ideology of Islamism, which for most of the Middle East means an end of this brief interregnum when they got independence from the Ottomans and now they're back. So this is, for the Middle East, the rise of Turkey is a return
you see
to
Turkey
normalcy.
becoming the regional power in the Middle East?
Yes. In Syria and in northern Syria and in northern Iraq, obviously. In the rest of Syria, they're going to have to fight the Israelis for it. But in northern Syria and in northern Iraq, which have enormous agricultural resources and energy resources, Turkey is the power.
Right.
And this rising Turkey will look around it and spot weaknesses and say, maybe I can go there. And
Yes.
they will see weaknesses in Greece, obviously. And they will see weaknesses in Bulgaria, right along their borders. So Greece, their maritime border and small land border, Bulgaria, land border. They will be aggressive in these areas, obviously. And they have an army of Muslims in Europe who is more radical than the average Muslim in the rest of the world because of the way that the European system works, which de facto encourages radicalization. And they will say, well, why don't we push? How far can we push and what can we extract? So the Europeans will be facing this massive security problem from the Muslim populations. And they will be facing a series of economic crises brought about by welfare, pensions, immigration, etc., that are simply dragging Europe down, and an energy crisis because of their relations with Russia being poisoned by the madness in Ukraine. And all of these things tend to come to a head at the same time. This is why it will be a decade of sorrows. It's going to be horrible for Europe in general. And they're going to have to fight on every front. They're going to have to rearm, something which they haven't had to do since the end of the Cold War. And even in the Cold War, all European defense assumptions were predicated on, we have to last for 3 weeks until the Americans show up. Really. So they're going to have to take their defense seriously. They are going to have a massive internal security problem. They're going to have Turkey as a serious rival. And they have deindustrialized and lost reliable energy. Do they pivot and say, forget everything that happened in Ukraine? Whatever you Russians want, we will help you so long as you help us? Or will they say, Turkey will do whatever you want? Or will they try to fight? I would imagine that they end up fragmenting, because there's never going to be a European military. The Spanish, the Italians, the French, and the Germans will never go under one leadership.
Well, I mean, that's
unless
one of the things,
it's an American
that's one of the
leadership
things
that's
I was thinking
occupying
about. You know, the US in withdrawing its sort of military support. I mean, military support doesn't just mean boots on the ground.
Exactly.
As I mentioned, it means satellites and refueling and all that kind of stuff. But another big element is in the post-war period, you've able to have these coalitions of armies because they've been led by a US general.
Exactly.
And, you know, you try telling a French general that he needs to take orders from a British general or vice versa. That's not going to work.
Or an Italian general.
Or an Italian general, yeah.
It will never work. So you see, as a result of that, the breakup of the European Union while they're stuck under the same currency and the same central bank.
Yes.
And so how do you untangle this mess?
So, I mean, what
How
you're
do you
essentially
break it
saying
up?
is that Europe ends up becoming somebody's bitch? I mean, they're already the Americans' bitch, but some of them might transition to being under the Turkish sphere of influence.
Different parts become different people's bitches.
Yeah.
So some of them become Russia's bitch. Some of them become Turkey's bitch. Some of them stay with the Americans. Some of them, try to build some kind of autonomy.
Yeah.
And one theme would be, okay, we have this massive migrant crisis, and now we're having to turn nationalistic. How does it make sense to cut welfare to natives while spending welfare on migrants? Well, we have to kick the migrants out. But the migrants are going to get backed by Turkey, which is a serious player. So you see this generating chaos for Europe. The Europeans don't understand where does security come from. First, it comes from internal strength. But this is something that is anathema to them, because if you believe in having a strong nation that is autonomous in a bunch of its industries, that is militarily strong, that respects its own culture, that cares first for its own people, well, then you're a Nazi.
Yeah. I mean, they cooked themselves, haven't they?
Exactly. They've committed themselves to a suicidal path. And the Americans are seeing this, particularly in Ukraine. And so when the Americans say, okay, do it your own way, they're going to understand what they've lost, but only when it's too late.
Well, at the moment, they're too addicted to, sounding off about Trump and how he's a bad man and all the rest of it. But, it's going to serve them right. Where do you think the UK lands in all of this? Because, I mean, we are in a slightly different situation from Europe, in that we're a part of the Anglosphere, we're a part of the Five Eyes. We could actually credibly remain America's bitch.
Yes. But there is the stark reality that the Americans don't need Britain.
Yes.
But they have an emotional attachment to Britain. And so the question then becomes, well, what can you offer them in order to stay in their sphere of influence?
Well, we're quite strategically well placed. We're a key part of the dollar system. If you're going to have a global dollar system, you do actually need somebody in this time zone who can process a vast amount of transactions. They can station equipment in this area, which gives them access to
But your
a wider
ambitions
sphere.
are naturally going to be rebuilding your own military, rebuilding your own energy, rebuilding your own companies, and strengthening yourselves. And the Americans will be saying, well, where's our cut? Because if we don't get a cut, we're not going to back you. So you will have to turn autarkic to some extent. And there is a level of competition when it comes to places like the Faroe Islands, Ireland, the Iceland, which are part of your joint security with the Americans. And so either you say, we're all part of the Anglosphere, and maybe we can help you bring in Norway into that to play a similar function containing Europe and providing advanced defense in a sense. Or you will have to say, well, we're going to have to go and do it our own way. If there is enough political will and popular support, you could argue we're going to have free movement of goods and free movement of people across the entire Anglosphere. And that becomes a major economic powerhouse. And it's a possibility.
Yeah.
But it's a theoretical one. It doesn't take into account the fact that in each of those Five Eyes countries, there are big corporate conglomerates that have their own interests, that want market share, that are competing with each other in other countries, and that have the ear of local politicians in their respective countries. So the game theory part of it isn't that straightforward. It should be, from a cultural and religious and ethnic perspective. It should be, but it isn't entirely.
Yeah, I did a daily video a little while back that the money managers in Europe are now fully, because their job is to live in the future.
Yes.
You don't make any money if you're trading on today's news.
Yes.
The people who trade on today's news are my exit liquidity.
Yes.
They're living in the future. And all the money managers have been having a number of conferences, as they always do. And the feedback I'm seeing from these things is that they just expect Europe as a whole, UK, to go firmly to the right and for it to basically become nationalists, for remigration to begin. They see all of Europe doing that. So it looks like Europe will start self-correcting, but obviously they're doing it. They're trying to shut the stable door after the horse has bolted.
Yes.
They're addressing the problem after the problem has become
Domestic and entrenched
Yeah.
and critical. And when the migrants came in, they didn't have a regional power backing them.
Yes.
Now they do. And that power will extract a price, especially from Southeastern Europe.
Mm.
So there are other dynamics here. But as the Europeans try to prioritize defense and internal security, this will have to be at the expense of welfare. And if you're in real estate, you're assuming a constantly growing population, remigration crashes the real estate market, which is in some ways a good thing for the youth.
Oh, it's a wonderful thing.
But
Bring
for
it
the,
on.
but for the money managers, it's a problem.
Yeah.
And if you have less demand because, I don't know, in France, 10% of the population, which is Muslim, has been forced out, and then you have the other non-Muslim foreign population that's also in France, if they get forced out, that's a big drop in demand. And that comes with a price. It's not an insurmountable problem, and it's a necessary problem to get to, but it is a problem
But there is a cost
for some
attached to it,
people in some areas.
Well, I mean, talking about immigration in those terms, all of that, I'm all in favour of, by the way, because native Europeans need to be housed. So I don't care if they lose as much money as they need to. The other angle on immigration, jumping ahead a bit when we get into the American sphere, is that let's say we are looking at a period of conflict. That again the late 2020s, 2030s are again the 2030s are a period of global conflict. It does set up an issue for the US in that when you go into a conflict, actually what you want is your white boys going off to die in the wars because they can actually be relied upon to point the gun the right way and take orders. But actually what you want is your bottom tier of the workforce, the stuff that is being done by immigrants at the moment, which is, factory logistics, driving, meat packing. I mean, all the basic stuff. That's exactly the stuff that ramps up when you go into a wartime situation. That's exactly the stuff that is being done by the immigrant population. So even assume it is a MAGA-based government at the time when we go into these sort of global conflicts, it creates a real conflict for them.
Yes.
They've said we're going to get these people out, but at the same time, suddenly you need more than ever to do all the bottom tier of the manufacture of all the bottom tier of the jobs market.
Yes.
While your white boys are off dying.
Well, you have to automate. And with the age of robotics, there is a lot that you can do, including in the military sphere. But you're going to have to automate a lot of that. Because if your supply of food, for instance, is dependent on migrant labor that you don't trust anymore, that's a massive security problem. A robot comes with its own security problems, but it's probably more reliable than Abdul. So you have these changes to how markets must work and which investments make sense. So if you're a company like Uber, unless your fleet is automated, you're dead. Whereas if you're Deliveroo, that's it, you're dead, and thankfully so. So different markets play out in different ways, and different technologies play out in different ways. What happens in war is usually innovation, because you have to test and retest and iterate. And as you try something on the battlefield, if it fails, you can't cover it up in the way the British government is covering up the failure of the Ajax fighting vehicles. You can't lie about it in the same way because people have died. And your officers will be telling you, listen, this is insane. We have to try something else. And so with that innovation, all kinds of other changes come that in a way after the war end up benefiting society. But this conflict has become necessary because so much of the Western elite has been suicidal in the policies that it's been pursuing, in its alienation of men, in its degradation of women, in its godlessness, in its liberalism and inability to distinguish between native and foreign, and its reversal in its inversion of good and evil.
Yeah, I mean, the whole West has done this, but I mean, Europe, as we talked about, has been especially suicidal and all
Yes.
of this stuff. And as I mentioned on the main podcast, the last thing the European elites should want is to militarize their young men, because they will be coming straight back on the elites
Yes.
when they do it. But pivoting to the American sphere, we touched on the Americans probably going to want Venezuela.
Yes.
Vast mineral and oil reserves, simply vast. So,
Yes.
so they're going to want them. We never really got a chance to touch on Cuba, which is an important element of this.
Yes.
I mean, it sits in the middle of the
It's one of the most
of the
strategic islands in the Caribbean.
yes. If you want to take oil from Venezuela to America, you have to go past quite a lot of Cuba
Yes.
in order to make that happen.
Yes.
Why are Cuba significant for Venezuela?
Well, they have been a dominant player in their intelligence agencies in sort of influencing and controlling the top elite of Venezuela. The rumors are that Maduro's bodyguards are Cuban,
Right.
because he doesn't trust the Venezuelans anymore. And this isn't the first time you see this. All across the Middle East, you find these dictators having foreign bodyguards. Saddam Hussein wouldn't allow anybody who wasn't Christian to come near his personal space, because he trusted that the Christians wouldn't try to kill him, but the Muslims would.
Remarkable.
So you get these very weird things happening in these spheres. Assad had Iranian bodyguards and Russian bodyguards. So this is not surprising. The Americans are saying it, but I find it credible because I've seen it elsewhere. But there is a big problem facing the Americans, which is that they want Venezuela, but it's not clear that they can actually take it. Because one of the things that I wanted to mention on the show was that the nature of the buildup so far allows for a blockade and allows for airstrikes, but not for an invasion.
Okay.
And the manpower that you need for an invasion of a country with 30 million people is quite substantial. You probably need 1 million soldiers, at least, to actually go and invade it and pacify it,
I mean, that's
in the initial
significant. I mean,
stage.
Venezuela, was it 30 million people?
30 million people.
And it's supposed to have a military of 125,000.
Yes.
But actually, Maduro probably counts about 1 million or 2 million militars in that, which are basically disorganized street gangs. But
Yes.
nevertheless, you can put a gun in their hands.
So they're the ones who would be keeping up an insurgency.
Hmm.
And if you're Colombia, if you're Brazil, you want to sponsor an insurgency in Venezuela, because if the Americans succeed in Venezuela, it's going to backfire on you.
Yeah.
That logic in the Middle East led the Iranians to back Shia jihadis against the Americans, while the Syrians backed Sunni jihadis who were massacring Shia and killing Americans, while the Syrians and the Iranians were in fact allies. So they backed different streaks of jihadis who absolutely hated each other and were busy murdering each other while they were allies, just so they could destabilize Iraq for the Americans.
Okay, so what's the running order here? Because Cuba is providing the intelligence, the structure, the order, basically they're the brains of this.
Yes.
To Venezuela, and in return, Venezuela was giving them oil.
Yes.
So that relationship works. Which one do you tackle first, or is it both at the same time?
Well, for the thing with these intelligence networks is that they don't necessarily need a state sponsoring them if they have a big revenue generator like drugs. That's why the CIA was involved in drug trafficking. Because they figured we could do whatever we wanted so long as we kept it off the books. How do we keep it off the books? We keep it off the budget. How do we keep it off the budget? We find a new source of financing. And so for these kinds of intelligence operations, especially when they're ideologically driven, you could say, I'm going to ally with the drug gangs of Colombia and with the drug gangs of Venezuela and with the criminal elements in Brazil, and unite them under this leftist ideology that wants to liberate Latin America from the gringos under the sword of the Bolivarian Revolution, blah, blah, blah. But we're going to be smuggling drugs and planting explosives. That's the long and short of it. And you then focus on taking out the businesses that are investing in natural resources, because you're not extracting natural resources from the cities. You're extracting it from the jungle, essentially, which lends itself to insurgency. Now, for the Americans, they've built up this force around Venezuela. If they start attacking and Maduro survives, that's a humiliation. if he doesn't actually abandon ship and leave.
And let's remember that the Americans have already taken one huge military humiliation recently with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So, I mean,
and another in the Red Sea.
Yeah. Well, yes.
And so a third humiliation in the span of 10
people start
years,
to really notice at that point. Yeah.
That then accelerates what we were talking about on the main podcast, which is the collapse of the order that is built on American security. Because if the Americans can't provide security, then they can't provide order. The two go hand in hand.
And my financial brain then says, well, why are we using the dollar then? Because the whole reason we started using the dollar in the first place was because of this tier of security. If we're looking at a world of regional powers, well, fine, I'll just keep a basket of regional currencies then.
Yes. Which, to further your point, that's why all of the sanctions are failing. The sanctions on Iran aren't succeeding. The sanctions on Russia aren't succeeding. The Mexican cartels have pretty much free reign in the banking sector. God knows how much money they launder every year. Some estimates put it at $60 billion being laundered in the Western financial system every year. You know that a lot of the big banks want that money. And the implication of that is, okay, you're no longer able to use the dollar as a weapon because you've overused it as a weapon. And that's reduced the importance of the dollar. And so you're in a position where the entire financial system depends on this. But part of the problem that the West has is excess financialization. Too many people who should be in engineering, who should be in medicine, who should be building infrastructure.
They're in finance.
Working in finance.
Yep.
Well, crashing the financial system and making it less profitable is a necessary step. But you know it isn't going to be done voluntarily. It has to be a pretty violent crash.
The US for the last 30 years has been able to live beyond its means by basically exporting pieces of paper with the president's face on it, bonds and bills and whatever else.
Exactly.
And getting real stuff in return.
Yes.
Now, that was a fantastic arrangement if they were going to use that excess to build up manufacturing capabilities, infrastructure and all the rest of it. But actually it's been blown on corn syrup to stuff down the throats of inner city black women, stadiums, consumption, retail. Effectively, they were handed this bounty and they've kind of wasted it.
Yes, exactly.
So, I mean, again, with a European reset, it's probably healthy in the long term for the people, but it's a hell of a disruption to the power situation.
The dross needs to be burned. All of this dross needs to be burned. And there's got to be a corrective fire to get rid of all of these sectors that have become incredibly unproductive, that have become destructive, and return to something sane. And the collapse of the American-led order, not of the United States, that's not what we're talking about, but this international liberal order,
the global hegemony
that we've been stuck with, that we call, the global American empire, that has to fall apart for the constituent parts of it to prosper.
Yes.
Because it's become so predatory, so destructive, so usury-based, so debt-based.
Well, and so corrupt.
Corrupt.
If they were doing all of that for the benefit of the American people, it'd be one thing. But it's for the benefit of a very narrow political class and donor class.
It's not in the nature of usury to be distributive in its benefits.
So essentially what we're talking about here is the emergence of regional powers. So we're going to have China as a regional power in its region.
Yes.
The US as a regional sphere in the Americas, perhaps the Western Hemisphere, possibly including Western Europe, Northwestern Europe.
Yes.
We don't know. Turkey as a regional power, a slightly smaller one for its area. I don't know, maybe Nigeria and Africa, and you could probably name some more. But a series of regional powers emerging.
Yes.
But US focusing on, we have neglected massively Latin America.
Yes.
It's been bought up by the Chinese. Oh shit, we need to refocus here.
Yes. Yes. You could argue that a saner alternative would be to build not one wall along the border, but 2 or 3, and say, screw Latin American resources, we will work with Australia and get their natural resources, which are
the
quite
Chinese
abundant.
have already bought them.
Well, they can be
They've
expropriated.
already got their hooks into
Yes,
Australia.
but they can be expropriated.
Yeah.
It's fine. But the problem is that when you do that, you end up with Chinese missile bases eventually on the territories of South America, and that becomes its own problem. So geography dictates that the Americans can't continue to neglect Latin America. But then the demographics create a different problem for America. Because 30% of the population is Latino, maybe 40% of the population is Latino now, this creates a huge problem. Because if the Americans have turned towards Latin America in order to regain control over it, these various governments will use their own communities in the United States.
I can imagine it'd be very split because, yes, let's say the US adopts a more belligerent stance against Latin America and starts trying to do regime change operations, but this time, instead of doing it in the Middle East all the time, it's now in Latin America all the time.
Yes.
I can well imagine a lot of the Latino population would be hostile to that. But then there's probably not a small percentage that got out of these areas and went to the US precisely because they don't like
Yes.
their domestic governments. And actually, they might be very enthused.
Some, I'm sure. I'm sure that some will be. But it still creates a problem.
Yes.
And it still creates this division. And the question is, can there be an electoral coalition that sort of manages this properly? The people who want a sensible, non-leftist, non-extremist Latin America allied with the WASPs in order to get there. If you become too exploitative of Latin America, that becomes difficult to achieve. Yeah. If you limit your objectives to just the Caribbean, for example, and Venezuela and Colombia, then you have something manageable. And you've got Argentina on the other end, willing to do whatever you want, and that is an acceptable state of affairs. And you don't go into the rest of Latin America. But you still have a massive problem with Mexico, as we discussed.
So let's start to close this out. But it does occur to me that Europe hasn't even begun yet, but is on the verge of self-correcting. Trump is self-correcting its posture. We're going to be less about the Middle East and Ukraine, and we're going to be much more about the sphere that actually matters to us. He's identified that Western Europe has become suicidal, and he's at least narratively changing that. There was a brilliant tweet that the Department of Homeland Security recently put out about suicidal Europeans and that kind of thing. The issue is that this is only on one side of the political aisle. The Democrats look at this point like they're bought and sold by China, bought and paid for by China.
Yes.
Knowing what they know, it becomes very difficult to maintain a democratic political system when one half of it is trying to actively betray the nation and destroy the long-term prospects of the US.
Well, I would go further. You are absolutely right. I would just go further. The Democrats, if they ever come back into power, are going to do things to the right that would make Keir Starmer blush. And they are going to try to jail everybody because they will think the problem was that between 2020 and 2024, we didn't throw Trump in jail and throw enough of his people to jail. We simply tried to do it, but didn't go all the way. Whereas the Charlie Kirk assassination was more effective. And so the extension of that logic would be when we regain power, if we regain power, we must do the unthinkable to consolidate our position properly.
Are you saying that American democracy is coming to an end?
Yes.
And there's a hard cap on that.
Yes.
The hard cap is when the Democrats come into power and the Republicans have to decide whether they're going to do it first.
Precisely.
Well, interestingly, republics normally only last about 250 years.
Yes.
And America is on the verge of celebrating its 250th anniversary.
Yes. Look, the Roman Senate continued to operate well into the Roman Empire.
Yes.
It was still there. You could argue that the College of Cardinals is still the Roman Senate in a spiritual form.
Mm.
So it doesn't mean that all of the trappings will be gone, but it does mean that, okay, we've had this debate, and from now on, whoever's at the top of the pyramid is
Yeah.
actually in charge and gets to shape the state as he or she wishes.
But I mean, if you have to acknowledge the fact that the global security situation is changing and it's becoming very unstable and very dangerous, you just can't afford to let a traitorous party back
Correct.
in.
Correct. Exactly. And the important thing to remember is that they see the Republicans as traitors. So the problem for the United States is that the Democrats believe that the Republicans are allied with Putin, which, if you looked at the Ukraine peace deal, is absolute nonsense. Whereas the other side believes, with a little more evidence from the Hunter Biden emails, that the Democrats are on the payroll of China. So that's the actual reality of it. Both sides now see the other as treasonous. That's why on Modad Geopolitics I wrote American Civil War, Second American Civil War is coming. Now the question is, how does it play out? Is it a sort of series of coups whereby, various bits and pieces of the Constitution are suspended while somebody consolidates? Or is it localized fights in different cities? Or is it even more severe? Or is it just at the level of riots and judiciary, which is where we are right now?
That feels like a theme that we're going to definitely have to come back to, but it's probably a bigger theme than we can discuss now. So
yes,
I think we wrap this up. Raj, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.